Well, now it's time to talk about questionnaire design. And like I said, in this series we're going to hit all kinds of topics. I'm going to give you some general guidelines for questionnaire design. I would highly recommend that you read your textbook chapter and your lecture notes, which have a lot more detail than I'm going to provide in this brief video lecture. So writing good survey questions, first of all, you should know is very hard. It is one of the most challenging things that a professional researcher has to do. It's often very difficult to get people to tell you what you want to know with a survey question, and a lot of times it takes a lot of revision and refinement to really get questions that are giving you the data that you need. I have a study that I do on a national scale for a lot of different organizations that are in a similar industry, and it took me about 5 years to get to my current standardized instrument, and even that is not perfect. I'm going to have to revise it again in a couple of years because the data that we were getting, they were good, but there were still a lot of questions about topics that were a little bit more in the realm of nuance, but that were important for our clients to know and that we couldn't fully answer with the previous survey instrument. So we got rid of some questions that weren't getting good data, that we thought would get good data, but they weren't, and we added in some new questions that are getting us great data, actually, as it happens, but there's still questions that we have that they're not fully answering, and we're going to have to revise again. So I'm telling you, as a person that writes a lot of surveys, a person that administers a lot of surveys, writing good survey questions is hard. I'm sure you guys know as students how hard it is sometimes for instructors to assess what you know in a class because they ask you terrible essay questions, right? So not in my class, I hope. So a few things that you should do when you're writing good survey questions. First of all, you need to be focused. And when I say be focused, I mean you need to break things down into understandable chunks. You don't want to be too general. You want to make sure that respondents have a good idea of what it is you're asking about and that they have a good ability to answer your question. You also want to be brief. You want to keep the questions as short as possible. Now that's not always easy to do. And sometimes I say short as possible because sometimes the questions have to go a little bit longer than you might like because there's a complicated idea that you're trying to test. But the more you can be brief, the better. Use simple sentence structure. This is both in terms of the words that you're using as well as the syntax of the sentences. I was assisting a student in the graduate program recently who was trying to use the word incentive to talk about what people wanted from a shopping experience. And I said, you can't use that word incentive. People have no idea what that means. And she said, well, I need to know what will incent them to shop at this particular place. And I said, you can't ask them that way. That's just, they're going to have no way to answer that question. That word incentive is too academic. So we had to find ways to talk about that in a bit more simple language. But it's important that you do that. Finally, be crystal clear in what you're asking. Make sure you're measuring precise ideas, that you're not getting things that are too easily personally interpreted or that have too much nuance about them. You want to make sure that you're asking about very measurable, specific ideas, that you have a crystal clear idea of what the interpretation of that data will be. What you shouldn't do, you should not ask questions that lead, and leading questions almost always are in a yes or no format. Now, there are times where you need to ask questions that are in a yes or no format. I don't want to say you should never ask those, but you want to make sure that most of your questions are not asking things in a leading way. Do you ever think that we will be able to go to Mars? You know, that kind of question that could only be answered with a yes or a no. As opposed to asking, what do you think is the likelihood that we'll ever be able to walk on Mars? And then you could ask that on a scale of 1 to 10, for example. So you want to avoid leading questions whenever possible unless you're using them for filtering or classification. You might need to ask sometimes, did you have a problem with service that you needed to bring to the attention of management, yes or no? And if so, how was that dealt with? Okay, well then that's a good time to use a yes or no question, but rarely are they necessary in a survey, and in fact a lot of times they should be avoided. You don't want to load. Loading is where you suggest either in your question or in your choices which answer is more desirable. You might not be doing it on purpose, but for example, if you're doing an advocacy study for a group that's doing some kind of public policy research about, let's say, environmentalism, you might suggest that one answer is the more environmentally friendly answer than the other, just in the way that you word the question. And that's going to make people answer the question a bit differently than if you just ask it straight. So try to avoid loading. Definitely don't double barrel or triple barrel or quadruple barrel or whatever kind of barreling you're going to do. That's where you have more than one idea that you're trying to measure in a question. So, do you think price and value are important when you're purchasing this product? Well, price and value are two different things. Price is about what you pay for something. Value is about what you get out of something. You can have a high-priced item. I mean, my car was a high-priced item, but I get a lot of value out of it because it's a hybrid and it gets good gas mileage and I really like driving it and it has really cool features. So I get a lot of value out of it. The price wasn't cheap. In fact, relative to other cars in its class, it was a little bit more expensive because of what it's got inside it. But the value is great. So double barreling can really lead you into trouble when you're analyzing data later on because you're not going to know, were they talking about price or were they talking about value? So make sure that you only measure one thing at a time, and if that means asking two different questions, then ask two different questions. It's okay to do that. Sometimes people get so caught up in rules of thumb about, only ask 10 to 15 questions, which is something that I'll tell you. Only ask 10 to 15 questions in a survey, aside from the demographic questions that you're going to ask. Okay, well, if you're following that rule, you might want to double barrel so you can have more questions in your survey, or you can have fewer questions in your survey that cover more data. Let me tell you, don't do that. Find a different way. Maybe have questions that have multiple parts, or use scales a little bit more creatively, or maybe just don't ask about price. Maybe just ask about value, or vice versa. Maybe only one of those is really important to you. Don't double barrel. And don't overstate. That's where you exaggerate the importance or the consequences of something. And again, this can lead to bias. So you want to make sure that you're not, in asking a question, exaggerating how important a topic is, or exaggerating the outcome. Do you think that if we don't reduce our impact on the environment, that it might lead to a catastrophe of global proportions? That would be overstating just a little bit, although that can be a little bit loaded too. Do you think that this is also leading as I'm thinking about it? Would you consider, or how likely would you be to consider purchasing a car that can get 90 miles per gallon in ideal conditions? That might be a bit overstated. So anyway, don't exaggerate the importance or the consequences of something. Try to keep your questions really neutral. Try to keep them really focused on what it is you're trying to measure and not on hyperbolic speech. And I'm not going to, by the way, I want to mention, I'm not going to test you in the exam on these labels. But I do want to make sure that if a question is poorly worded, that you're going to be able to identify the reasons why it's poorly worded. You don't necessarily need to say it's leading or it's loaded or it's double-barreled, but you need to say, hey, it's trying to measure two things, or hey, that language is really overly exaggerated, or things like that. And then you need to be able to tell me how to word the question correctly. That's much more likely what you're going to see on an exam. Now, another thing that you really need to understand is how to arrange a survey. There is actually a pretty good recommended approach for how surveys should be set up. And one common mistake that people make is putting the classification or the demographic questions, like how old are you, how much money do you make, things like that, at the beginning of the survey. When they think, oh, I want to get those questions out of the way, they're easy questions, and then we can do the survey. Well, no, actually they're really intrusive questions, and they're also really boring questions, and they don't get people too excited about taking your survey, so we put them at the end. But you need to start off your survey with an initial introduction about what the survey is about. It's usually very brief, and it often leads into a set of screening questions. And screening questions help you determine whether or not someone that you're about to interview is suited to be in the survey. For example, if your survey is only going to be with SIUe students, that's going to be a screening question. Are you presently enrolled as an SIUe student? And if they say no, you're going to terminate the survey and move on. If they say yes, then you're going to continue the survey. So your screening questions come after that initial introduction, and then you can have your longer introduction about what the survey is about. And that longer introduction is also going to talk about if this is an anonymous survey, if it's a confidential survey, how the data are going to be used. Generally speaking, you need to give them some indication of what it's going to be used for. You might want to identify the sponsor of the survey here, or you might not, depending on the kind of survey that you're doing. But all of that is going to go right here after the screening questions. Then you're going to ask some warm-up questions. These are usually going to be kind of soft, easy to answer questions. In a lot of surveys that I conduct, I ask questions like, what do you think the strengths of organization A are? What do you think its weaknesses are? I just ask them really easy to answer open-ended kind of questions to get them in the mode of answering questions and to get them kind of to give their top-of-mind information before we start measuring things. It can be really useful. Warm-up questions may or may not be relevant to the analysis that you're going to conduct. You might just ask a few arbitrary questions to just get them in the mode of the format that you want them to answer, and then you can actually, get some real questions in after that. But warm-up questions, I would suggest using them to get as much usable data as possible. If you're going to bother asking people for something, then don't waste their time. Then you're going to have some transition text to let them know that you're moving into a section that's going to be maybe a little bit longer, a little bit more difficult. And it's good every now and then to put a transition in, let people know, okay, we're moving into another section now. We're going to switch gears. We're going to think about a new idea. We're going to talk about questions a little bit differently now. I'm going to ask you about a hypothetical situation. Give them some kind of transition. You might also want to include some signposting. We're a third of the way through the survey. You're doing great. We're moving right along. We're going to be at the end very soon. Or, hey, we're past the halfway point now. Or, hey, we're rolling into the home stretch. Those kind of signposts are really useful so that people don't terminate or break off in the middle of the survey because it's going on too long. And it also keeps them from getting antsy about, hey, when is the survey going to end? I have other things I want to do with my life than answer survey questions. So signposting and transitions can help with that. Once you're done with your complex and difficult questions, then you can move into your final transition, which is generally where you say, we're in the home stretch, we're almost there. I'm just going to ask you a few more questions. These are going to be a lot easier. And then you can ask them those classification and demographic questions that are about just the more factual data about who they are. And why do we put those at the end? Well, first of all, if somebody breaks off or terminates, those are generally the least important questions. Anything that's super, super important is generally a screening question. So these classification questions are just kind of tacked on at the end to give us some things to profile the data set by. Also, these questions can be a little intrusive sometimes, asking people, how much money do you make, and what's your age, or things like that. If we didn't need to know that for the screening criteria, they don't always like to answer those things. So if we put them at the end, there's a lot more pressure to just be done with the survey. They'll feel a lot better about just answering them to get done. They also have had time now to build rapport with you as an interviewer, or with your computer program, or with the piece of paper that they're filling out. They feel a little bit more comfortable answering questions. And finally, like I said, if they break off, it's not always a big loss if you don't have that data, but you got all their valuable opinion data. So that's why we put them at the end. After that, you're going to say thank you, and then you're going to go through your termination script, or you're just going to get done with the survey and move on and let them go their own way as well. So that's how a survey should be arranged, generally speaking. Now, there are a few mistakes that I want you to avoid, okay, when you're doing a survey. First of all, that chart that I just showed you, how to arrange a survey, don't put the questions in the wrong order. Don't put the demographic questions first. Don't put the hard questions first. Follow that structure. You will be much better off, I promise you. Also, don't wait until the middle of the survey to ask a screening question. I mean, why would you do that? That if they're not qualified for the survey, why would you want to collect information from them in the middle? Halfway through the survey, find out if they're qualified. It's just not worth your time or your trouble. Don't violate those do or don't guidelines that I showed you a couple of slides ago. Write questions that follow those rules. And in your lecture notes, I've also included a list of words to avoid, and they're usually words like anybody, or ever, or most, or best. Really definite language that can suggest things that can make your data get kind of skewed. If you ask people, can you think of any situation where you've ever been disappointed? Well, when you ask them, can you think of any, then you're asking them to pick anecdotes rather than general descriptive language. And you're inviting them to give you the outlier data as opposed to their normal experience. So you want to be careful about things like that. And that's why it's important to really think about what sorts of data a question will gather, both in the way that you word the question and in maybe the way that you're trying to measure the question. So if you're asking a really complex question like, how likely are you to purchase this item, you generally don't want to ask that in a categorical format. You want to ask that in more of a scaled format, partially because you're going to be able to analyze the data much more capably if you have that scaled data, but also because there's a lot of nuance to a question like that. Would you consider purchasing this new phone that I'm selling? if the answers are yes or no, or yes, no, or maybe, there's a lot of nuance there. So it's much better to have a scale of 1 to 7 or a scale of 1 to 5 or something like that, where they can indicate their intention, and that helps you kind of get a relative read on how interested they are, as opposed to just yes, no, or maybe. Writing questions that ask far too much information is also a major mistake you want to avoid, whether that's just because it's a really complicated question or because you are asking a lot of questions, maybe in a matrix table or something like that, that are just, there are 50 different points that you want them to rate, of this product, and they just can't think of those 50 things and how they would rate those things. Like imagine a bag of Doritos, for example, and you want them to rate every single part of the taste profile. It's going to be really difficult for the average consumer to do. Asking questions not easily answered falls in that camp as well, where you might ask a question where somebody has to think for a little while. What's the meaning of life, the universe, and everything? Well, if you've read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, you immediately will go 42, but most people will have to actually sit and think about that question for a while. It's not easily answered. They're not going to give an answer they're happy with. They might even want to go back and revise it later on. So it's okay in a test setting, if you're testing students, to ask questions that are not easily answered because you're trying to assess if they actually know something, but in a survey, most of the time, that's not a good idea. Failing to test your survey on a human being. Okay, this is the big one. This is the one that a lot of students don't want to do. I don't know, maybe they're nervous about it. You need to test your surveys before you put them out for research. You need to test them because you generally don't know if your questions are good or not because you haven't tried them on another person, and B, as a researcher, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to ask questions in ways that get answers that you'd never considered, and you're also going to include typos, or you're going to include weird wordings, or you're going to use jargon that's not easily understood. Any of the above are reasons why you need to pre-test your surveys. So pre-testing just means running it by another human being. It might be a more formal process, but generally it's just running it by another human being. Pilot testing is actually a more structured process where you might say, okay, we're going to get 50 responses. I'm going to test this on 5 people. And if those first 5 interviews go really well, then I'll continue on to the other 45. Otherwise, I'll go back and revise the survey before we go on to those other 45. So pilot testing is a little bit more structured, but it's a similar idea. In either event, make sure you are running your survey by another human being, another set of human eyes, another human perspective before you administer it to a larger group of people. Your survey will be better for it. You will be a better researcher for it. You will get better data. You will look smarter. You will come to better conclusions. I promise you. If you don't take the time to do it, you're just not going to get the information that you're looking for as well as you would if you had run it by another human being. With all that said, there are so many nuances and facets of survey and questionnaire design that we could talk about that we're just not going to get to in this lecture series. And it's not because they're not important, it's just because this class is a survey of these things. It's a survey, right? It's intended to be a general survey course as opposed to a class that tells you all the ins and outs of what survey research is all about. So with that said, if you have any questions, please contact me. Please refer to the lecture notes and the textbook. I'll be very happy to answer any questions that you have, or look over any survey questions that you might be putting together that you want to see what another human being actually has to say. Just let me know. Thank you.